Alright, so in this video we're going to get into M units and Rem units. Up to this point we've pretty much been using pixels for everything, which is a fixed unit. So M and Rem are similar, but they're multipliers of different things. So an M unit is a multiplier or relative to the font size of its parent container or its parent element, where a Rem unit is it's relative to the font size of the root HTML element. Okay, so if we look at an HTML file, this right here, this HTML tag, its default font size is 16 pixels, but of course you can change that within your CSS. So I know it's kind of tough to explain, so let's jump in and let's create a file called 14_m_rem.html, and we'll put our head body tags in here, and let's say M and Rem units. And then for the HTML, I'm just going to have a box1 div, and let's do an H3. Let's do a paragraph. We'll do lorem 20, and then I'm just going to copy the whole div here. Okay, so this one we'll do box2, box2. Alright, so let's save this and let's open up Live Server, and let's open up our dev tools as well here, and we're going to be in the Elements tab, and I'm just going to go ahead and select let's select the paragraph. Now by default the font size as well as the margin here it's going to be set to 1em, so whatever the number of pixels of the font size of its parent element, and by default obviously its direct parent is the box1, which we haven't set a specific font size, so it's going to keep going up until it finds a font size which it's going to reach the HTML, the root element. Okay, this is the absolute root element, and by default that's 16 pixels. So if we go to computed, you're going to see that the margin is 16 pixels, the font size is also 16 pixels. Now headings are a bit different. If we take a look at that, let's grab the selector and click on the heading, you can see the font size is actually, the computed font size is 18.72, because if we look at the actual CSS from the browser, the font size is 1.17em. So the reason for that is 16 pixels, or 16 times 1.17 is actually equal to 18.72. So that's where this comes from. Okay, now if I were to manually change the font size of the direct parent, which is box1, so let's say font size, we'll change it to 20 pixels rather than 16, and watch what happens to this font size of the H3. Okay, I'm going to save, and it gets turned to 23.4, because 20 times 1.7, that's what that's what this is set to, 1.17 is going to be 23.4. And if we look at the paragraph now, the font size is 20 pixels. So is the margin. You can see right here, the margin on the start and the end, also 20 pixels because it's set to 1em. Okay, as you can see right here. So it's going to be whatever this is. Now let's say we wanted to change the font size of the paragraph, so we'll say box1, let's see, we'll do box1 paragraph, and let's set font size to, let's do 1.5 em, and save, and you can see it gets much bigger. And down here, this is our styling, font size 1.5em. So let's look at the computed value. The computed value is 30 pixels. Excuse me, and the reason for that is because 120, which is its parent element, times 1.5 is equal to 30. That's where we get 30 pixels from. And it's also automatically going to add that margin to the top and the bottom of 30. Now, one thing that's confusing about M units is if I do padding, right? So let's say padding 1em. What? Just take a second and think of what this is going to be. Remember, 1m is a multiplier of its parent, so you might think that it's going to equal 20, right? Because 20 times 1 is 20. So let's save it and let's see what we get. So for padding, which is right here, we actually get 30. The reason for that is since we added a font size to the actual element itself, the paragraph, it's going to go on that now. Okay, so the padding is going to be, since this is 30 pixels, it's 1.5 times 20, and then we set this to 1m, then it's going to be 30, and that's very confusing. So that's one reason that a lot of people don't use m's, and one reason I don't use m's. So another reason is for nested elements. So let's go ahead and add down here ul, and I'm just going to put in a couple list items. We can use a money sign, which will just start at 1 and go in increment by 1. We'll say times 4 tab, and then we get these 4 list items. Now this one here, I'm going to add another ul, and let's do the same thing. We'll say times 3, and we'll save, and we have these list items here. So let's say we want to change the font size of a ul that's in box 1. So box 1 ul, and let's say we want the font size to be 1.2m, and let's go ahead and save that. So if you look at this ul, the nested list right here is bigger, right? And we can check that out by using the selector. Let's look at these ones here. So we get 24 pixels, but if we look at these ones here, we get 28.8. So it's not consistent, and the reason for that is these inner elements here are actually now going on the nested, their parent element, and we have a nested ul here. So this is going on this, and if we were to put another ul, like let's go ahead and grab this and put this right here and paste that in, we'll nest it again, it's going to get even bigger. So that's another issue with using m's. So my suggestion would be just to drop m's altogether and use rems, because they're always going to be based on the root element. Alright, so let's start to get into that. So I'm actually going to comment out the whole div here, the whole box 1 div. And let's see, we'll comment this stuff out too. So we'll just kind of start from scratch, and now we'll look at rem units. Now I'm not going to set a font size to the parent element itself, box 2, because we're very rarely going to do that. We're going to be using rem units, so we're going to go on the root element always. So let's grab the h3. So box -2 h3, and let's set the font size to, let's say, 2 rem. Okay, we'll save that, and let's take a look at what that is. So if we go and hit that and we look at our computed styles, you'll see that it's going to be 32. Like I said, the HTML, or the root element, font size is always going to be 16 pixels unless we manually change it. So you can see it's 32. If we set, let's say, box 2 paragraph, and set font size to, let's do 1.6 rem, and we save that, and we take a look at the computed size, it's 25.6 pixels. Okay, because 16 times 1.6 is going to be 25.6. Now let's actually add a line height here. So the height of the line, and I'm going to do 1.7 rem. Now remember, when we used m units, if we had set a line height here, it would actually be based on this, right? But since we're using rems, it's always going to be based on the root HTML element. So let's save it. Let's take a look at the line height, and it's 27.2, which is 16, the root element's font size, times 1.7. So much less confusing. If we wanted to change the root element font size, we could do that. So let's go right here and just simply do HTML, and let's say font size 10 pixels, and we'll save, and notice that everything got smaller. So if we check out the font size of the heading here, it's 20 pixels because the heading is set to 2 rem, right? So it's going to be 2 times 10, which is 20. The paragraph, try to take a guess at what that's going to be. Let's check it out, and it's 16 pixels because 10 times 1.6 is 16, and if we look at the line height, it's 17 because we set it to 1.7. And this is actually a common thing that some people do, because when you deal with 16 pixels as the root element, it's harder to figure out what the exact size is going to be. If you set it to 10, then you're going to know that 2 is 20, 1.6 is 16, this is 17, 2.8 is 28. You know, if we set the font size here to 2.3, it's going to be 23 pixels, right? If we take a look at it. So let's grab the heading, it's 23 pixels. So a lot of people will do that, and to make it even more responsive, we could just set the font size to a percentage, to 62.5%, which is actually going to be 10 pixels. If I save that, it's the same thing, 23. And if we look at the font size of the text here, it's going to be 16 because we set it to 1.6 rem. And just to show you, if I set it to 1 rem, it's going to be 10. Okay, so you might see this as well. I tend to leave the HTML at 16 pixels and just kind of eyeball things rather than being so exact. If you're taking an actual design from, like, I don't know, Photoshop or something, and the pixels need to be exact, then you might want to do it this way. You might want to set it to 62.5 so that you know exactly how many pixels you're adding to padding and all that. For me, I do a lot of my designs just by eyeballing it, just by doing the HTML CSS, not actually copying an exact design. So I'll usually leave the the root element at 16. Now, another huge reason to use Rem units is for accessibility and browser settings. Now, if I go to my Chrome settings and go down to where it says font size, you'll see it's set to medium. That's the default, that's the recommended. But if I set it to very large and I use Rem units, notice it's gotten bigger. In fact, down here you'll see the paragraph is now 24 instead of 16. Because we've manually set that in the browser settings. If we use M units, it has no effect. In fact, I'll go ahead and take this off and take this comment off, and we'll save it, and it has no effect. So if it's set larger because of what we did up here, but watch if I set it to very small. Notice that all the stuff we did with the M units is still huge, while if we go down to where we use rems, it's very small. Okay, so it's not going to have an effect if your parent elements have font sizes. Now, if we didn't have a parent element font size, it would go by the HTML, even if we used M's, and then it would work, because that's what this is doing. This is changing the root element's font size. If we didn't have this here, let's get rid of that and save. Now you'll see that this is very small because it's going by the root element by default. But when you use M's, you're adding font size to the parent element, and that's what it goes on, regardless of the settings in the browser. So just another reason that Rem units make things more adaptive and more responsive. So let's set this back to medium, and I'm going to comment this stuff back out. Okay, so I know that this may be confusing, But it is a good idea to use Rem units. If you want to use M units, you can, but that's, I mean, everybody has their own style, their own way of doing things. I don't really use M units except for maybe some special situations. But you know, using Rem, it makes it more accessible. If older people that can't see very well, they want to change the settings, it'll actually work. You know, it makes things more responsive, more adaptive. So it is recommended, but you could also stick with pixels. It's all up to you guys, you know, whatever is easier for you. But we will be using Rem units quite a bit throughout the rest of the course. All right, so in the next video, I want to take a look at another CSS unit, which is the viewport height and the viewport width unit, okay, which are really used for something completely different, used more for like boxes and backgrounds and stuff like that, rather than like font sizes. All right, so I'll see you in the next video.
Living life every day, late at night, not okay. All I want, and I pray, all I need are some better days. Fuck me, I'm looking in the mirror, so foggy, but I've never seen clearer.